February 1947. The Strait of Malacca. The water that day was flat and colorless, the way it gets when the heat presses down so hard that even the ocean stops moving. Two American merchant vessels, the Silver Star and the City of Baltimore, were making routine passage through one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. The routes were familiar. The radio frequencies were standard. There was no reason to expect anything other than another slow, uneventful crossing. Then the signal came in. It didn't announce itself the way a distress call usually does. There was no calm, procedural voice reading coordinates. What came through was broken, fractured, barely decipherable, a voice drowning in static, repeating something that took the radio operators a moment to fully process. The message, pieced together from the fragments that survived, said this: all officers including captain are dead, lying in chart room and on the bridge. Possibly whole crew dead. And then, after a pause that operators would later describe as deeply wrong, I die. And then silence. The Silver Star altered course. What they found when they reached the drifting vessel, the Dutch freighter SS Ourang Medan, was not the scene of a tragedy they had any framework for. The ship was intact. No collision damage. No visible flooding. No fire. No structural failure of any kind. The hull was sound. The cargo was undisturbed. The ship itself appeared to be in perfect working order. The crew was not. They were everywhere. Sprawled across the deck, slumped over their stations, lying in the corridors. Arms outstretched. Eyes wide open, staring at the sky. Mouths locked open in expressions that the rescue team, in their reports, struggled to describe. Not just dead or frozen. Every single face fixed in an expression of absolute terror. As if, in the final moment, every man aboard had seen the same thing. Something that had stopped their hearts simultaneously. Something that had reached into their bodies. And shut them off. There was no blood. No wounds. No signs of struggle. No indication that anyone had fought, fled, or even had time to fully understand what was happening to them. Even the ship's dog was dead, curled near the stern, its body rigid, its lips pulled back, teeth bared at something that was no longer there. This was not a shipwreck. This was not a mutiny. This was not a disease or a storm or a fire. This was something that left no explanation behind. Only the dead. And their faces. The Strait of Malacca has always been a passage marked by strangeness. For centuries, sailors working those lanes described encounters they couldn't categorize, ships found drifting without crew, vessels that vanished mid-voyage with no recorded weather event, men who returned to port speaking of sounds they heard below the waterline that had no mechanical source. The colonial-era Dutch maritime records, stored in archives in The Hague, contained dozens of incident reports that were classified not as accidents but as unresolved anomalies. The terminology was deliberate. Something happened in those waters that resisted the standard language of maritime catastrophe. But the Ourang Medan case cut through all of it like a blade. Because this time, there were witnesses. The rescue team from the Silver Star didn't just file reports, they talked. The men who stepped onto that deck carried what they found there with them for the rest of their lives. One crew member, interviewed by a Dutch maritime investigator, described the sensation of boarding the Ourang Medan as a pressure he felt in his chest, a heaviness that didn't come from grief or nausea but from something he couldn't name. Something in the air itself. A wrongness that had no visible source. Another described the faces of the dead in terms that went beyond clinical observation. He said they looked like men who had been frightened out of their bodies. As if whatever they had seen had been so fundamental. Why incompatible with human consciousness that the mind had simply stopped? Then there are the accounts from the navigators. Separate vessels, weeks apart, reported anomalous electromagnetic readings in the same corridor of water. Compasses behaving erratically. Radio communications dissolving into static without atmospheric cause. One captain logged an entry describing a smell, acrid, chemical, unlike anything produced by the cargo manifests of any ship in the area, that lasted for 2 days before disappearing entirely. He filed it as an unclassified sensory event. His crew refused to discuss it. What begins to emerge, when you lay these accounts side by side, is not a collection of unrelated oddities. It is a signature. A pattern of symptoms, physiological, atmospheric, electromagnetic, clustering in a specific region, around a specific type of event. The Ourang Medan was not a freak occurrence. It was the moment the pattern finally left a ship full of dead bodies behind as evidence. To understand what may have been aboard the Ourang Medan, you have to understand what the Strait of Malacca was in 1947. The Second World War had ended less than 2 years earlier. The Pacific Theater had been the site of some of the most aggressively experimental weapons programs in modern history: chemical agents, biological payloads, substances that existed in no official inventory and appeared in no signed treaties because the nations developing them had never formally admitted to their existence. When the war ended, those programs didn't simply stop. The materials had to go somewhere. The men who had worked on them had to be managed. The knowledge had to be contained. The Ourang Medan was a Dutch-registered vessel operating out of a region that, in 1947, was in geopolitical freefall. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, was in the middle of a revolutionary independence struggle. Colonial authority was collapsing. Oversight of shipping manifests was inconsistent at best. In that environment, certain kinds of cargo moved without scrutiny. Certain kinds of shipments were arranged quietly, outside official channels, by men who understood that documentation was a liability. The theory that has persisted longest, and that has proven most resistant to debunking, is that the Ourang Medan was carrying something it was never supposed to be carrying. Possibly nerve agents. Possibly nitroglycerin or potassium cyanide stored incorrectly in the hold. Possibly something less categorizable, a compound developed during the war years whose effects on human physiology were not yet fully mapped by the scientists who created it. What matters is this: the ship's official cargo manifest, when it was eventually recovered and examined, listed nothing that would explain the scene on deck. The manifest was clean. And in the world of post-war black market chemical transport, a clean manifest is not evidence of innocence. It is evidence of planning. Something was placed aboard that vessel deliberately, by people who knew what it was, and who calculated, correctly, that if something went wrong, there would be no record to trace it back to them. There are moments in history that seem, in retrospect, to have been structured by a terrible logic, a sequence of decisions, each individually defensible, that together produced something monstrous. The loading of the Ourang Medan was one of them. Whoever arranged the cargo understood the risks. Chemical compounds of the kind suspected don't behave consistently under heat and pressure. In the hold of a ship moving through equatorial waters, temperature fluctuations can destabilize even carefully sealed containers. The Strait of Malacca sits near the equator. The cargo would have been loaded knowing that the journey itself was a gamble, that the margin between safe transit and catastrophic release was thin. But the cargo moved anyway. Maritime historians who have examined the timeline not something significant. The Ourang Medan's route that February was not its scheduled route. The ship made deviations that had no recorded explanation. It passed through sections of the strait it had no reason to enter. This suggests the course was altered to avoid inspection points, the kind of procedural choice made when the people responsible for a cargo are aware that discovery would be fatal, professionally or otherwise. The crew, in all likelihood, didn't know what was in the hold. They knew something was wrong by the time it was too late to act on it. The radio operator's final transmission, that broken, desperate signal that reached the Silver Star and the city of Baltimore, wasn't a formal distress call. It was a man describing, in real time, what was happening to the people around him. Officers dying mid-sentence. The captain down. The crew collapsing at their stations. And finally, the operator himself, transmitting into the void as the last conscious person on a ship full of the dead. He didn't abandon his post. He stayed at the radio until whatever was filling the air of that vessel reached him too. That detail, the act of a man using his final minutes to ensure someone would know, even if no one could help, is the part of this story that resists any comfortable explanation. because it means someone knew it was happening. And they transmitted the information because something in them refused to let it go unrecorded. Whatever took that crew, it took them fast. And it took them all. The rescue team from the Silver Star made the decision to tow the Ourang Medan to the nearest port. They worked quickly. The faces of the dead were too much to leave unattended. That was the language used in the report. Too much to leave unattended. A phrase that tells you more about the emotional state of the rescuers than any clinical description could. Men trained to manage maritime emergencies, men who had served during the war and had seen the things wartime producers, were unsettled at a level that exceeded professional composure. And then the ship began to smoke. It started in the cargo hold. A thin curl of dark smoke rising through the ventilation shafts, carrying that same acrid, unidentifiable smell that had been noted in other incident reports. The rescue team recognized immediately what it meant. They cut the tow lines. They got back aboard their own vessel. The Ourang Medan exploded. The blast was described as massive, disproportionate to anything that should have been possible given the registered cargo. The ship didn't just burn. It detonated. The force of the explosion lifted sections of the hull clear of the waterline before the vessel sank. Within minutes, the Ourang Medan and everything aboard it, every body, every face, every clue, was gone. It sank in deep water in the Strait of Malacca, and it has never been found. This is the moment the story crosses from tragedy into something else. Because the explosion was convenient in a way that accidents rarely are. It destroyed the physical evidence at the precise moment a rescue team had arrived to document it. It eliminated the bodies, the cargo, the manifest, and any trace of whatever had killed 23 men without leaving a mark. The Dutch Maritime Commission opened an inquiry. The inquiry found nothing because there was nothing left to find. The case was quietly filed as unresolved. But the men who had boarded that ship, who had walked those decks, looked into those faces, felt that wrongness in their chests. They didn't file it away. They talked. Quietly. Among themselves, and eventually to others. And what they described was not a ship that had suffered an industrial accident. It was a ship that had been visited by something that left no trace except the dead. The first formal published account of the Ourang Medan appeared in the Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council in 1952, a dry, procedural summary of the incident. That nonetheless acknowledged the central mystery: no cause of death had been established for any member of the crew. That detail matters. In maritime investigations, cause of death is almost always determinable. Drowning, trauma, asphyxiation, fire, each leaves a physical signature. The Ourang Medan crew left none. The bodies showed no signs of poisoning in the conventional sense. No marks. No ruptures. No evidence of external force. The Dutch maritime authorities confirmed this in their own documentation. The inquiry, limited though it was by the loss of the physical site, returned a verdict that used a phrase almost unprecedented in maritime law: undetermined cause, ruling out all known mechanisms. They didn't know what had killed those men. And they formally admitted it. In the years following, a Dutch journalist named Silvio Scurley published a series of detailed accounts claiming to have sourced testimony from witnesses who had not come forward officially. His sources, sailors, port officials, a former colonial administrator, described a cargo that had been loaded under conditions of deliberate secrecy, with handlers who wore gear inappropriate for standard freight. One source claimed to have seen documentation listing the cargo's origin as a post-war chemical disposal program operated jointly by a Western military authority and a private shipping contractor. None of this was ever formally verified. But none of it was formally denied either. The Office of Naval Intelligence, when later asked about the Ourang Medan by American researchers filing FOIA requests in the 1980s, returned responses that were heavily redacted. Not denied. Redacted. The distinction is significant. Denial closes a door. Redaction acknowledges that there is a door and that someone has decided not to open it. A researcher named Roy Bainton, who spent years tracking the Ourang Medan case through maritime archives in 3 countries, concluded that the ship existed and the incident occurred, but that the documentation had been systematically thinned, key pages missing from official records, registration numbers that led nowhere, crew manifests that listed men whose maritime employment histories ended abruptly in 1947. Dead men. Every one of them. Not from the Ourang Medan. From other circumstances, other vessels, other years. But men connected to the ship and its final voyage, who were no longer alive to speak. The scientific community has not ignored the Ourang Medan. The most widely cited conventional explanation involves carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning boiler or engine room fault. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and lethal in high concentrations. A crew exposed to it would lose consciousness and die without visible trauma. The facial expressions, the open eyes, the terror, could be explained by the convulsions that accompany rapid oxygen deprivation. The brain, shutting down, produces involuntary muscle contractions. A face locked in what looks like a scream may simply be a face whose muscles have frozen mid-convulsion. This is plausible. It is consistent with some of the physical descriptions. Then there is the hypothesis involving nitrous oxide, laughing gas, or methyl bromide, a fumigant used in cargo holds to kill insects and vermin. Methyl bromide is extremely toxic in enclosed spaces. If improperly stored or accidentally released in a sealed hold, it could incapacitate an entire crew before anyone realized what was happening. It leaves no visible wound. It kills by attacking the central nervous system. A third explanation draws on geological phenomena. The Strait of Malacca sits over a tectonic boundary. Pockets of methane and other volcanic gases are periodically released from the seafloor. A large release of hydrogen sulfide, for instance, could incapacitate a vessel's crew within minutes. It would explain the smell noted by nearby ships. It would explain the electromagnetic irregularities. It would explain why the deaths appeared simultaneous. These are not dismissible theories. They are grounded in chemistry and geology. They are the kind of explanations that investigators reach for because they can be mapped onto known mechanisms and existing frameworks. They are, on the surface, reasonable. But the surface is where these explanations live. Beneath it, they collapse. Carbon monoxide poisoning does not produce simultaneous death across an entire crew of 23. It works gradually, room by room, deck by deck. Those with limited exposure survive longer than those in enclosed spaces. Someone would have made it to fresh air. Someone would have shown differential survival. The rescue team found no one in worse shape than anyone else. Every man was equally, completely, identifiably dead in the same unnatural posture. Carbon monoxide doesn't do that. It can't. The methyl bromide theory fails on the same point and adds a new problem. The rescue team breathed the air of that ship. They walked its decks. They examined the bodies. If a fumigant were present in concentrations capable of killing an entire crew simultaneously, the rescue team would have been affected. They were not. They reported a sensation of unease, a pressure, a smell, but no chemical incapacitation. Whatever had killed the crew of the Ourang Medan had either dissipated entirely between death and discovery, or it was not a standard atmospheric agent. The geological methane hypothesis is the most geographically plausible, but it cannot account for the electromagnetic phenomena or the nature of the transmission. A man dying of hydrogen sulfide poisoning loses consciousness within seconds. He does not compose a coherent, emotionally articulate radio message describing what is happening around him. The radio operator's transmission was structured. It was sequential. He named specific locations on the ship. He identified specific categories of people who were dead. He was thinking. Clearly enough, in his final moments, to transmit actionable information. That is not consistent with any rapid-acting neurotoxic gas. And then there is the explosion. No geological gas release, no engine fault, no fumigant discharge explains a blast that was described as massive and structurally catastrophic by multiple trained witnesses from a distance. The Ourang Medan didn't leak. It didn't burn slowly. It detonated. With violence entirely disproportionate to anything on its official manifest. The rational explanations account for parts of what happened, but no single one accounts for all of it. And when you try to combine them, to assemble a composite explanation from their overlapping plausible parts, you find gaps that the facts refuse to fill. The faces cannot be explained away. The simultaneous deaths cannot be explained away. The explosion that destroyed every piece of evidence at the exact moment witnesses arrived cannot be explained away. There is a particular quality to cases that refuse resolution. Most historical mysteries have a shape, a structure of unknowns that suggests, even if it doesn't confirm, a certain kind of answer. The Ourang Medan has a different structure. It suggests, not an unknown answer, but an answer that has been deliberately made unreachable. The ship existed. The distress signal was received by multiple vessels and recorded in official maritime logs. The Silver Star's course alteration is documented. The Dutch Maritime Inquiry is documented. The explosion is documented. These are not the hallmarks of a fabricated legend. They are the hallmarks of a real event whose details have been systematically removed from the record. What fills that space, in the absence of evidence, is the testimony of the men who were there. They described something that did not fit their previous experience of death at sea. Not the scale of it, they had all seen mass casualties. What disturbed them was the character of it. The UFO. Remedy. The expressions. The sense, reported independently by multiple members of the rescue team, that the dead were not simply men who had died. They were men who had seen something. Not a mechanical failure. Not a chemical release. Something that presented itself to them in the final seconds of their lives and left its mark on their faces. The Strait of Malacca closed over the Ourang Medan in 1947 and has not given it back. Whatever sank with that ship, the cargo, the bodies, the final logbook entry that no one ever read, rests now in water too deep and too dark to search. But the radio transmission still exists in the archives. And at the end of it, in the silence after the operator said "I die," there is something the machines recorded that was not a voice and not static. Something between a signal and an absence. Something that the engineers who reviewed the tape decades later filed without comment, because there was no category for it and no instrument that could measure it. The Ourang Medan is not the story of a ship that was lost. It is the story of a ship that encountered something, in those flat, colorless, equatorial waters, that the world was not ready to name. That may still not be ready to name. That may never be. The crew is still out there. Somewhere. Their faces still set in that expression. Still looking at whatever they saw. And it is still, whatever it was, in the water.